Sa video na to, malalaman ninyo ano ba talaga ang pinanggalingan ng Scout Rangers.
Kung gusto niyo masubaybayan ang mga istorya ng sundalo ng bayan, pakiclick ang like at subscribe at pindutin na rin ang notification bell.
Bago ko ipagpatuloy ating video, shout out muna sa mga kababayan natin, lalo na mga reservist ng islang probinsya ng Samar. Ang inyong kwento ay kasama dito sa history ng Scout Rangers. Alamin niyo, ito yun.
There are many contenders for the coveted title of most effective elite force in World War II, but every unit, from the Japanese 343rd Naval Air Group to the British Commandos, suffered combat losses, except one. This elite American force completed over 100 missions deep behind enemy lines and played a vital role in the liberation of the Pacific. This is the story of the Alamo Scouts.
Alamo Scouts, kalahati ng Ranger, di ba? Scout. Ito yung kalahati. So, alamin muna natin paano nabuo itong unit na to during World War II at saka paano naman na-connect papunta sa Scout Ranger.
The Alamo Scouts was the brainchild of the US 6th Army's commander, Lieutenant General Kruger. Having risen from the ranks and fought on the front lines of 3 previous wars, Kruger recognized the value of good intel.
Para may dagdag na context, ang naputos kay Kruger na magbuo ng sariling intel unit ay walang iba kundi si General Douglas MacArthur. Bakit? Noong nag-assume si Douglas MacArthur as Southwest Pacific Area Commander, ay nakarely sila masyado sa OSS, Office of Strategic Services, ang intel agency na inaayawan ni Douglas MacArthur. Nung sinimulan niyang sa katuparan yung kaniyang island hopping strategy, pabalik sa lugar na kaniyang iniwanan, ang Pilipinas, ay kailangan niya ng magandang intel. Maraming mga palpak yung taga-OSS at ayaw rin ni MacArthur na may mag-operate ng mga intel units na hindi directly reporting sa kanya. So, kailangan niya ng actual na information na galing sa kanyang mga tao. Ano pala yun? Human intel. At sinong gagawa nun? May asset ba sila doon ng mga Papua New Guinea? Ng mga taga-Papuan? Wala. So, kailangan sarili niya sundalo. Paano gagawin yun? Magbuo ng reconnaissance unit. At doon ay nabuo ang Alamo Scouts. Bakit nga ba Alamo Scouts? Sila ay under sa 6th Army, under dito sa command ni General Kruger. Ang 6th Army ay binuo ni MacArthur para may direct control naman siya. Sana mo si MacArthur ayaw niya na wala siyang control sa mga sarili niyang kababayan na sundalo. Ang Southwest Pacific area ay mayroong land forces na ang pinuno diyan ay si General Thomas Blamey, isang Australian. Kung tutusin, kung 6th Army ang pangalan ng mga Army forces, under yun doon sa land forces, di ba? Gusto ni MacArthur, sarili niyang control. So, pinangalan niya Alamo Force. Direct control kay MacArthur. At mula doon sa Alamo Force, o yung kilala sa US bilang 6th Army, dating nakabase sa Texas, ay binuo ang Alamo Scouts. Yan ang context ng kwento dito. Okay? Hindi si Kruger lang, mismong si Douglas MacArthur.
But as his 6th Army advanced through the Pacific, good intel was in short supply. Seemingly from nowhere, massive numbers of Japanese troops appeared in his path, and he was forced to fight through them. These Japanese defenders were often cut off from their main supply bases closer to Japan. With careful avoidance, they could be starved out. This was a far better solution for the Americans.
Para mas klaro sa atin, ito yung Southwest Pacific area na kung saan mag-operate ang tropa ni MacArthur. Ito yon. Dito sa Southwest Pacific area, kung makita mo, ang hindi lang nasakop ng mga Japanese forces ay ang mainland Australia at saka sa Papua New Guinea ay kalahati, di ba? So kalahati kung makikita ninyo. At kailangan mabawi ito ng Southwest Pacific area ng Allied Forces ni MacArthur gamit ang kanyang Alamo Scouts bilang tagabigay ng intel. Kasi tigasin ang mga Hapon na naka-station dyan at may malaking air forces na andon sa Rabaul, isang island north ng Papua New Guinea. So kailangan matalo muna niya itong mga naka-station ng mga land forces ng Japanese o Imperial Japanese Army na nasa Papua New Guinea. Yun. Sabi natin.
Then engaging them in battle. By bypassing Japanese troop concentrations, thousands of Allied soldiers could be saved. But to do that, Kruger needed good intel, and he wasn't getting it from his staff. He needed an elite unit of scouts that could operate behind enemy lines as his eyes and ears. So, in November 1943, he founded the Alamos.
November 28, 1943 ay itinatag ang Alamo Scouts, ang Scout Ranger, di ba? November 25, 1950 or about 7 years later. So, isa sa mga opisyal na part dito sa binuo na Alamo Scouts ay si Lieutenant Rafael Eleto. Fresh graduate from United States Military Academy, kilalang West Point, at siya ay nag-report bilang bahagi ng US Forces. Doon siya nag-serve at doon siya sa 6th Army o sa Alamo Force. At siya naman ay isa sa napili, ang mga tigasin lang daw pinipili doon eh. So kasama mismo si Rafael Eleto, and of course, maliban sa pagiging West Point graduate, siya ay Pilipino at siya ay tigasin, bagong graduate. Kailangan ang mga mag-serve sa Alamo Scouts, kasi matindi ang training doon, ay mga tigasin. So doon sa first training ay dito nila ginawa sa Ferguson Island sa Papua New Guinea.
Scouts. 700 candidates from the 6th Army were selected for scout training, which lasted 6 weeks. Candidates were selected for their jungle warfare skills, keen perception, and physical stamina. All had previous combat experience, and all were volunteers. If you didn't want to be an Alamo Scout,
Parehas lang din sa Scout Ranger ngayon, dapat volunteers at least mayroong 1 year experience, di ba? Sa field.
you could leave and return to your old unit at any time. The training was grueling and few made it through. In one exercise, candidates were blindfolded and made to navigate through the jungle without being seen or caught. Using sound, smell, and touch, they had to remain camouflaged and navigate to a specific area.
Matindi ito ha. In a way, ang ibang mga practices na ito sa training ay napopopya ng Scout Rangers sa Special Forces. Dahil yun nga, ang unang nagturo sa kanila ay isang Alamo Scout graduate.
If they were spotted by the instructors, snipers fired live rounds into the trees and the ground.
So ito na ang example ng ating yung battle indoctrination. Dito pala yun ang galing sa Alamo Scout training ha.
Around them. This was meant to motivate the candidates to do better. The training course was likely the most intense of the war and included.
So nakita niyo, kasama rin ang hand-to-hand combat o unarmed combat. Sa Scout Ranger, ganun din. Sa US Ranger, meron din yan. Parehas. So nakita natin saan ang pinanggalingan ng mga training practices ng kasalukuyan na Scout Ranger na Special Forces.
Included, amongst other exercises, night fighting, enemy weapons training, a 10-page written exam, treatment of infected cuts, gunshot wounds and malaria, aircraft recognition, actual patrols into enemy territory, rudimentary Tok Pisin, Malay, Tagalog and Japanese language, combat judo and guerrilla tactics.
So nakita ninyo, kasama sa inaaral nila, maliban sa hand-to-hand combat, ay paano sila mag-survive, no? Mayroon silang first aid, yung kung sa ngayon ayun yung combat lifesaver, at meron silang language. So wala yan ngayon ba? Language. So ngayon, dialect dapat yan. Kung saan ka ma-assign, dapat marunong ka sa dialect na yon. So yun yung nawawala. Okay? So may idea tayo kung saan ma-assign ang ganitong klase mga special operator, ay kailangan mayroon siyang knowledge about the language or dialect. And in fact, pati enemy weapons, inaaral nila paano gamitin yung weapons na ginagamit ng mga kaaway. Napaka-importante. At babalik tayo, yung ginagawa nila, itong Alamo Scouts na to, it's more of reconnaissance. Ano ba kasi kaibahan ng reconnaissance at saka yung isang combat unit? Ang isang patrolling mission ay i-divide mo yan sa tatlo. Una, combat. Pangalawa, reconnaissance. Pangatlo, ay tracking patrol, di ba? So dito sa combat, yun yung direct action na tinatawag. Raid at saka ambush. Yun yung ginagawa ng mga US Rangers. Itong pangalawa, reconnaissance, ito yung ginagawa ng Alamo Scouts. Okay? Ang reconnaissance is, yung mission na yan is to gather information about the enemy and the ground that he controls or the terrain that he controls. Yun ang tinatawag ng reconnaissance. So, ang design ng kanilang training ng Alamo Scout ay base doon sa doctrine ng reconnaissance na kung saan hindi talaga sila necessarily mag-engage bagkos ay magbigay ng information tungkol sa enemy para maplano ito ng combat unit, no? Yung striking force, yun yung mag-hit doon sa kaaway. Ganyan ang diskarte, ha? Hindi yung ikaw na yung naghanap, ikaw rin yung mag-strike. Mahirap yun. So, sa planning ay merong tinatawag na TLP, Troop Leading Procedure. Yung remersis. At yung isa doon, yung R ay recon. Pag mag-send ka ng recon, i-complete mo yung plan. Pagbalik, no? I-complete mo yung plan. So, yung product ng recon, yun yung sketch ng kaaway, yung basic salute report, size of the enemy, yung saan ang location, ano yung action, anong unit niya, mga relevant information that will inform the commander paano niya iplano, gaano kalaki ang gagawin niya, saan ang ruta na gagamitin, o yung direction of attack, at kailangan ba ng reserve, saan ilalagay. At kung kailangan ay combined arms operations, paano i-employ ang other element of combined arms team. So, ganon ang importansya nitong reconnaissance. Tanong-tanong, mga taga Division Reconnaissance Company, aralin ninyo itong history ng Alamo Scouts, anong ginawa nila, anong contribution nila, para ma-idea kayo on how to improve on the way you conduct operations.
At the end, the candidates were given a chance to report on each other. This assessed whether they were actually team players, a test still commonly used in Special Forces training today. Of the 700 initial candidates, 321 passed the 6-week course to become
50%.
full Alamo Scouts. Of these, only the best 138 were retained, while the rest were sent back to their units to organize scout units of their
138
own.
out of 700.
But their real test was yet to come. Once qualified, individual Alamo Scouts were organized into 6 to 7 man teams.
So nakita niyo, ang Alamo Scouts ay inorganize siya na 6 or 7 man team. So alam niyo na kung saan nanggaling ang 7 man team concept ng Scout Rangers.
Each team member was a demolitions expert, sniper, radio operator, and point man in his own right, so decisions were often made democratically, a system still common in today's Special Forces.
So yung mga designation, doon din nanggaling sa Alamo Scout. Okay? Kung ikaw yung lead scout, ikaw yung guide, kung ikaw yung team leader, kung ikaw yung navigator or telo, blah blah blah. Yung lahat na yon na mga designation ay inspired dito sa Alamo Scouts.
Their first mission was a recon job in the Admiralty Islands, located in the north of the Bismarck Archipelago. Aerial imagery suggested the islands had been abandoned by the Japanese, and General MacArthur wanted Kruger to deploy.
Para maging klaro tayo, nung sinimulan na yung island hopping na attack ni MacArthur, nag-contribute doon ang Alamo Scouts. At nakatatlong klase sila. 3 classes ang nagawa nila simula doon sa Ferguson Island. Pag mag-advance na yung mga tropa, nag-advance din yung school. Ganun ang ginawa nila. Naka 3 locations sila noong andun sila sa Papua New Guinea area. Hanggang sa nakarating sila sa Pilipinas. Okay? Pagdating na sila Pilipinas, ang una nilang napuntahan ay Leyte. So sa Aboyog Leyte, doon si Rafael Eleto. Siya doon sa na-designate yung team niya mismo. Kasi nag-train siya, dito pa lang siya sa Papua New Guinea. Okay?
800 men of the 1st Cavalry Division to occupy them. But Kruger had his doubts. He didn't believe the islands were abandoned, so he sent in the Alamo scouts to make sure. As it turned out, he was right. At 0645 on February 27, 1944, a Catalina flying boat carrying Lieutenant McGowan's Alamo scout team landed just off the southeastern tip of Los Negros Island. While the propellers were still turning, the scouts launched a rubber boat from the Catalina and paddled to shore.
Nakita ninyo, ang isa sa skills ng mga scouts ay ang waterborne operations. At ito yung nasa larawan. Magtataka kayo, bakit sa Scout Ranger Training mayroong waterborne operations? Galing yan doon. Dahil mayroong pagkakataon na kailangan ay gagamit tayo ng inflatable boats para sa ating infill. At iyon ay isa sa pamamaraan para hindi ma-detect ng mga kaaway kapag inflatable boat yung gagamitin. Ayos ba?
After concealing the boat, they disappeared into the jungle. McGowan's scout team stealthily moved inland, following subtle tracks left by enemy soldiers. They discovered 3 camouflage machine gun positions.
So, yung tinatawag na tracking and counter-tracking. Yun yung isa sa skills nila. Pag once napunta sa lupa, ang titingnan natin ay ang tracks. No? So, ano yung mga indications about enemy presence? Ilan sila? And we are taught on how to read the tracks. Okay? Makikita natin na papunta ba yan doon? Nagpa-atras-atras na lumakad yon. Makikita natin kung bago pa lang based doon sa naiiwan niya sa foliage o nakikita niya sa disturbance sa mga dahon o sa mga damo na naapakan o sa mga dahon na andyan sa paligid, sa forest floor. So, iyon ang mga skills na galing sa Alamo Scouts. Sa atin nga ngayon, dinagdagan pa nga skills galing mga ita, di ba? Tinuturuan din tayo ng mga ita, yung kanilang indigenous tracking skills. Sa mga ita, nakita ko yan, natuturo din sila sa atin.
Connected by a trench line and could hear Japanese soldiers manning the position. Kruger was right. The island was still occupied. If the 1st Cavalry had landed as planned, they would have been massacred.
So nakita nyo, if hindi makapagbigay ng tama na information, halimbawa, nasaan ang malaking puwersa ng kalaban na nakaabang. Okay? Kapag malaman nyo ng mga record units, iiwasan nyo ng attacking force. Okay? So, ganun ka importante. Hindi mo masakir ang abutin nila kung ang kanilang paglandingan pala ay yung mismo strong point ng mga defenders. So, yan.
Scouts pulled back from their observation point but were almost detected by a Japanese platoon. Saved by their perfect camouflage, the men lay on the jungle floor while 15 Japanese soldiers wandered by just 3 meters away. They never noticed the scouts, but the scouts noticed them. Namely, their insignia marking them out as Japanese Marines. They also carried spades and picks.
Yung naka-deploy sa Southwest Pacific ng mga pwersa ng Japan, actually ay dalawa. Imperial Japanese Army at saka Imperial Japanese Navy. At merong rivalry yung dalawang unit na yan ng Japan. Kaya minsan hindi sila coordinated dahil meron silang hidwaan. Nagpapataasan sila ng ihip. Basahin niyo sa history.
Along with their rifles, indicating their intention to dig in. McGowan noted their uniforms were clean and well maintained too, illustrating their high morale. Once the Marines had disappeared, the scouts set up camp in a little-used part of the jungle. They radioed what they'd seen back to base and were picked up by Catalina the following night. McGowan's report was rushed to Kruger and the other generals, who called off the landing and organized a massive naval and aerial bombardment of the island. The 1st Cavalry made their landing later and suffered only light casualties. By the end of their first mission, the Alamo scouts had proven invaluable. But their greatest feat was yet to come. In June 1944, Filipino guerrillas, supported by the Allies, reported that roughly 500 POWs were being held in a Japanese prison camp.
Shortcut niya eh. Doon pa muna sa Leyte, mayroon pang Battle of Leyte Gulf. Okay? At nung nakuha na nila yung Leyte, yung may Leyte landings na in October 1944, ay nagtayo ulit sila doon ng Alamo Scouts Training Center. Doon sa Abuyog Leyte. Kaway-kaway, taga Abuyog Leyte. Hanapin nyo Baka makikita niyo ba, baka kampo yan sa kasalukuyan. Yung dating inoccupy ng Americans dyan, maaaring minana yon ng Philippine Army or ng Philippine Constabulary. At yun ay ang site ng Alamo Scout Training Center. Noong andyan sila sa Leyte, 1944 yan.
Near the village of Cabanatuan on the island of Luzon. This information wasn't acted on until January.
So this one is pertaining to the greatest feat, yung sinasabi pinakamatinding accomplishment ng Alamo Scouts ay doon sa Cabanatuan. Yung tinatawag na Pangatian Raid. Ang lugar actually ay Pangatian, ito ay parte ng Cabanatuan City. At doon ay naka-detain o naka-imprison ang mga Allied Forces, karamihan mga Amerikano, at mayroong threat na maaaring pagpapatayin sila lahat. So, sino ang bigyan ng misyon para malaman ano ba talaga ang location ng lugar na yon at paano gamitin ang kanilang direct action mission na unit, ang Rangers, para ma-save ang mga prisoners o yung mga POW, prisoners of war. Ito yung kwento na yon.
January 1945, when Kruger's intelligence officers devised a rescue plan. The spooks had received words that retreating Japanese forces were liquidating POW camps before abandoning their positions. Contravening both the Geneva Accords and basic humanity, the Japanese were
So para may context tayo, this is January 1945. At the same time, sa paglan ng mga US forces dito, yung Tagaytay Airborne Landing, nag-link up sila sa pwersa ni General Castañeda at hanggang sa pa-forward sila papunta dito sa Manila, yung Battle of Manila, February 1945. Pero bago yun, mayroon din kasalukuyang operations na nangyari at iyon ay sa Cabanatuan City. Ito yung mission para i-save ang mga POW doon sa Japanese prison camp.
killing off POWs to stop them from falling into friendly hands. They were also aware that any POWs left alive could testify against their captors once the war was over. The POWs had needed rescuing, and the Alamo Scouts were gonna make it happen. On the night of January 29th, 2 Alamo Scout teams met up with members of Captain Hosson's guerrilla companies.
Captain Bahota at saka si Captain Hosson. Guerrilla forces yan. Familiar ba ang Hosson family? Sinibay siya, naging political clan sila, di ba, ngayon? Ito si Captain Bahota, yan yung nasa movie na The Great Raid, starring si Cesar Montano. Ito yon. At sila yung nilink up ng mga Alamo Scouts. At hindi rin mapatawaran ang contribution nila Captain Bahota doon. Dahil gano'n na naman, kung hindi nakinig ang mga kano sa advice ni Captain Bahota, ma-wipe out na naman sila. Dahil ang mga guerrilla forces ay alam na alam nila ang lahat ng locations ng libo na mga Hapon na naka-station doon sa lugar na yan.
These men knew the region better than anyone and were willing to guide the scouts in. The guerrillas got the scouts close to the camp, but there wasn't enough cover to set up an observation post. Lieutenant Nellist, the scout leader, dressed up as a local farmer with Filipino-American scout Private Vakala. In full view of the Japanese guards, they walked to a hut 300 meters from the camp fence.
So doon natin makukuha ang idea yung training ng Scout Rangers na komando. Ito yon, nakita ninyo sa Scout Rangers, yung commando operation, ganito yon, dito yon nakuha.
From there, the men spent 8 hours observing the camp and calculating its defenses. The Filipino guerrillas made contact with locals who had been forced to work in the camp and collected additional information for the scouts. Once compiled into a report, the guerrillas transported a copy back to headquarters, where Lieutenant Colonel Mucci's Ranger Battalion was waiting.
Si Henry Mucci, yun yung sa 6th Ranger Battalion. Okay? So yung Alamo Scouts, at saka yung 6th Ranger Battalion ni Henry Mucci. So, nakita na saan ang galing Scout Ranger.
If the Alamo Scouts were the scalpel of this operation, the Rangers were the sledgehammer. That evening, with support from the guerrillas, they attacked. They left their base at 1700, arriving out.
So, Scout Ranger ay mahusay sa guerrilla operations dahil alam mo Scouts, 6 Ranger Battalion at may mga guerrilla sa Pangatian Raid, doon na buo ni Rafael Elito Scout Rangers. Tutuloy muna natin.
Outside the camp in complete darkness. At around 1900, a series of loud explosions tore through the quiet night. A P-61 Black Widow from the 547th Night Fighter Squadron overflew the camp at low altitude, periodically cutting and restarting one of its engines. The resulting backfires drew the attention of all the camp guards.
Ang tawag dito, joint operations. Mayroong taga-ibang branch of service, which is the US Air Force. Ground Force, plus another branch of service, kaya joint operations. And yung combination ng kanilang action ay yung effect noon ay mag-lead to the success of the mission. At yung role dito ng Air Force, more on tactical deception. Para malinlang yung mga kaaway. Paputok dito, ganyan, sila, ma-confuse sila, ano ba talagang balak ng mga to, what is happening, yun.
Guards who assumed the plane had been damaged and was hurtling toward the ground. The pilots, Captain Schreiber and First Lieutenant Rux, completed their act by flying over the nearby hills less than 10 meters above the ground. As the distracted Japanese defenders waited for the inevitable explosion, guerrillas cut the telephone cables and the Rangers got into position. At 1940, they attacked. Small arms fired from the Rangers tore into every machine gun nest, guard tower and pillbox at the same time. With intelligence from the scouts, the Rangers engaged every part of the Japanese defense simultaneously. The result was devastating. Within 15 seconds, every pillbox and tower had been destroyed. While the Rangers focused on the killing of the Japanese, the Alamo scouts guided the POWs to safety. Many were too sick to walk, and the scouts had to carry them out, but these men were so emaciated that a scout could carry 2 at a time. Private First Class Kittleson, an Alamo scout responsible for getting the POWs to safety, later said, "I didn't fire around there. I didn't have to."
Nakita mo, alam mo Scouts, kung anong mission binigay sa'yo, yun ang gagawin mo. Hindi sila nakikisaw-saw doon sa direct action. At nakapokus sila kung ano yung binigay sa kanya na mission, which is to save the POWs. So yun yung ginawa ni Kittleson at nakatanggap ito ng mataas na award mula kay General Kruger mismo after nung kanilang action dito.
My job was to get those prisoners to the river, so I did that. Sometimes you had to almost grab a hold of them to keep them going the right direction, but they got there. By the end of the attack, the Rangers, guerrillas, and Alamo scouts had liberated 552 POWs from the camp at Cabanatuan.
By the way, ni-research ko, saan si General Rafael Elito dito sa The Great Raid? Wala siya dito. Dahil ayon sa history, siya naatasan na doon sa Leyte. So, nakakalat sa buong Pilipinas ang more or less 17 na mga Alamo Scouts team. At ang andito ay yung around siguro 12 or 13 na Alamo Scouts ang nag-operate dito sa Central Luzon. Kaya wala dito si General Rafael Elito. Ngunit, siya ang nagbuo ng Scout Rangers.
The Alamo Scouts suffered no losses. In fact, they never suffered a combat loss throughout all of their 106 known operations behind enemy lines. So that was the badass story of the Alamo Scouts, one of the most successful elite forces of the Second World War. But what do you think?
Diba, Astig, di ba? At dahil ako ay malaking pagpapahalaga parati sa kasaysayan, binisita ko yung Pangatian Raid Memorial. Doon mismo sa location ng The Great Raid incident. At panoorin nyo, anong itsura nito ngayon? Diba? Napakaganda. At harinawa ay mapa-improve, ma-protect pa to dahil yung section na ngayon ay inaalagaan ng mga Amerikano, maganda. Hopefully, ganun din ang pagpahalaga natin sa ating kasaysayan sa pamagitan ng pag-maintain ganun dito sa side naman ng Pilipinas na memorial. Oo, tingnan ninyo. Diba? Mas maganda dito sa kabila. At ayun, nakita niyo na Scout Rangers, ang mga musa, ay nanggaling sa dalawang astig na mga unit. Ang Alamo Scout na walang namatay kahit na isa during World War II. At ang pangalawa ay ang 6th Ranger Battalion na siyang nag-team with the Alamo Scouts para i-rescue ang more or less 500 na mga PAWs sa Cabanatuan City. So, ang ating Scout Rangers ay parte sa kasaysayan. Pagkatapos na ito ay binuo ni Captain Rafael Ileto at pinamunuan niya ito hanggang 1955. Dahil ang unit na ito ay nag-participate sa Hook Campaign at maging sa Camlon Campaign sa Sulu. Magkaroon tayo ng sariling kwento later on tungkol sa mga participations na ito sa local campaigns ng Pilipinas simula noong 1950s. O ayan, alam nyo na. Scout Rangers. Alamo Scout, 6th Ranger Battalion. Scout Ranger. Bago ko tatapusin ang ating video, nais ko na magbigay sa inyo ng isang parangal para sa mga Scout Rangers pagkatapos natin nalaman ang kasaysayan nito. Ang mananalo dito ay makasagot kung saan ang location ng Alamo Scout Training Center pagkatapos ng Battle of Leyte Gulf. Makukuha niyo ba ito? Kung alam niyo ang kasagutan, ilagay niyo sa comment section at i-invite ang inyong mga kaibigan na i-like ito. After 3 days, may mananalo, ipa-LBC ko ang Scout Ranger shirt ninyo. Ayos?